Hi, everyone. Welcome to Breakout Session A, Direct Service. My name's Sydney, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm a member of the Scholars Leadership Team, and I'll be acting as a moderator for this session. As a quick reminder, this session is going to be recorded and uploaded to the Bendon Center Conference 2022 website. So today we are joined by Glenn Bailey. Glenn Bailey has been the Executive Director of Crossroads Urban Center in Salt Lake since 1992. Mr. Bailey is a community organizer who has done neighborhood organizing in Oklahoma City through Neighborhood Services Organization, and in Chicago is the Executive Director of the Southwest Community Congress. He has also served as an anti-hunger advocate, an activist in disability rights movement, and an advocate in for the civil rights of the homeless. Crossroads Urban Center operates one of Utah's busiest emergency food pantries, a free and low-cost thrift store, and a variety of community organizing and advocacy efforts. Now I'm going to turn the time over to Glenn.
So I have a little slideshow. I got to tell you a slideshow story because I worked at Crossroads back in the 80s before I moved to Chicago. And we actually had a slideshow. It was a projector and a carousel. You hit the thing, and so I would haul that around to do presentations, and it had a script. And they had it stolen out of my truck in Central City. We had to pay Crossroads back. So slideshows are kind of a touchy subject, and I'm not good at the PowerPoint, but I've cobbled together some slides from other people's PowerPoints that might help give you a little better sense for what we do at Crossroads. And since I wrote that bio, we have another food pantry, which we opened in 2017. So we have two in Salt Lake City. So we'll talk about that a little bit. First, I just want to introduce you to Crossroads Urban Center, where I work. And this is our building in 1909. We still operate out of that building, one of the busiest food pantries in the state. That's at 347 South, 400 East. Right now, we're tucked between two high-rise apartment buildings being built on either side of us. So if you come trying to find us, a lot of people drive right by, end up calling us because we have a front yard and buildings on either side of us. So Crossroads was founded in 1966, but this building has been used for service since 1905. So we come out of the work of the Women's Home Missionary Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church, which started work in Salt Lake City in the 1880s. And they had a building that they called the Davis Deaconess Home, which was named after Eliza Gibbon Davis, who was the second president of their organization nationally. Downtown, about where the Wells Fargo Tower is, the big blue skyscraper with the helipad on top. They sold that right after the turn of the 20th century and bought this building and actually added on to two additions. And they moved the Deaconess House there. The Deaconess House was a place where women who were doing work in neighborhoods and parishes throughout Utah had a home base. They actually had a big mission out at the Bingham Canyon Copper Mine, a place called Highland Boy, where they had a lot more services to the immigrant miners. That's long since become part of the ever expanding pit. So that doesn't exist anymore. But then in the 30s, about 1937, they decided that they didn't really need an exclusive home for deaconesses in Salt Lake City. So they created something called Davis Esther Hall, which was a boarding house for young women who were going to school and working in the city, whose families wanted them in a Christian environment. So we would have, in this building, they'd have something like 14 women living together, supervised by the deaconesses with a cook and a caretaker and so forth. And that's the job they did back in all the way until 1965. In 65, they decided to close that. There wasn't such a need for that facility anymore. And I've been around Crossroads long enough that I've met women who used to stay in the boarding house, coming by and stay. This was my bed. Not in a long time. Used to see that. They tell me great stories about it. But when they no longer had the Davis Esther Hall, they got together and did what Methodists do really well, which is form a committee, and they decided to create something that would be of service to the neighborhood. So our neighborhood in those days was more residential, and for many, many years, A lot of people don't know, but the zip code 84111 downtown had the highest infant mortality rate in the state. So they really reached out to people who lived in the neighborhood around. Crossroads is meant to designate the crossroads of the West. One of our original board members from 1966 is still around, so I can ask her these questions. And what they decided to do was to try and come up with some way to serve people in the urban environment. Salt Lake was a pretty light urban environment, but still, this is as urban as it gets in our part of the world. So they started a preschool. They started a youth drop-in center. They started 2 different drug abuse rehab centers that still exist today. One is Odyssey House, and the other is Cornerstone Council, which is part of Volunteers of America. So they allowed them to start there. And pretty quickly, they created a thrift store in our building to give free stuff to people in need, largely supported by local churches. About a month later, they started the food pantry that we still run today. So these are very old services that we've been providing for a long time, really before a lot of other folks got into the emergency services business, low-income emergency services business. In the early 70s, they made a couple of decisions, the board of directors of Crossroads. And Crossroads is a 501c3, so our board is all volunteers, and always has been. But they made 2 really big decisions. One was that they needed to be broader in their base, that they needed to be ecumenical. So really what happened is when I worked at Crossroads in the 80s, the average Presbyterian, UCC, Lutheran, Episcopalian had as much ownership of Crossroads as the average United Methodist, because they really reached out to a much broader base to support the work. The second thing they did, which is super important and still guides our work today, is that they decided to work on the root causes of hunger and poverty. So in other words, why does somebody need to go to the thrift store to get used clothes to send their kids back to school? Why does somebody need to come to our food pantry so that they can have enough food to feed the family and get through the month? What are the reasons for those that cause those situations, and are there things that we can do about it? And so that's led to a commitment by Crossroads to doing community organizing and advocacy. So when people come to us, we find out what the needs are. For instance, the number one reason why people would use an emergency food pantry is they just paid the rent. And rents are super high. We're just breaking. We have a huge surge in our food pantry usage and the thrift store right now. And it's partly because of increasing prices. So we know the rent's too high, but there's not enough low income housing. So a lot of our advocacy, a lot of what we focus on, when we do organizing and advocacy is affordable housing, really low income. So that's an example of how that works. So through the years, Crossroads has started a lot of things. We started a group called Wasatch Community Gardens that helps people grow their own food. Originally, that project had an urban aquaculture component. It was later abandoned after they spun off from Crossroads. We started Utahns Against Hunger, which is a statewide anti-hunger advocacy organization. Still exists today. It started at Crossroads in the late 70s. We started a group called the Disabled Rights Action Committee, which still exists, and is made up of people who have disabilities who are working on issues that were important to them. So back in the 80s, that was access to public transportation. So what we did was, believe it or not, in those days, there were no lifts on buses and there was no tracks. So if somebody in a wheelchair wanted to go somewhere, the chances of them being able to take public transportation were pretty small. And they had the demand that UTA never buy a bus in the future that didn't have a lift. UTA could not agree to this. So what the folks in the Disabled Rights Action Committee did was block buses on Main Street. Because in those days, all public transportation went through Main Street. And it was 4 lanes. And so at rush hour, they went out and parked their wheelchairs in front of a bus and back of a bus, and buses couldn't move, and they blocked up 3 lanes of Main Street to get the attention we need to get. Of course, today, nobody would consider buying a public conveyance that wasn't accessible to people with disabilities. It's a very different time. And then they focused on the Americans with Disability Act. And today, most of their work centers on trying to come up with ways to help people who are in nursing homes because of their disabilities get out and live more independently with attendant care, which is cheaper for everybody and better for the folks that are trying to live with those disabilities. So those are some examples of groups that we've started over the years. But what people know us for best is our direct service. Let's see what the next slide is. So that's the building more or less today. The building on the left, as you're looking at the screen, no longer exists. And on the right, they're building a high-rise apartment building right on our property. But we're still there and still feeding a lot of people at this location. So this is a picture of our food pantry. So if people know anything about Crossroads at all, they usually know that we have a food pantry. We have two, actually. This is the downtown food pantry. And at the downtown food pantry, we help people with a 3-day supply of food up to twice a month. If they have a place to cook, we help people 3 times a week, as often as 3 times a week with a day bag of food if they're on the street or without a place to cook, which about half of our clients downtown are. Many are unsheltered, and very many are experiencing homelessness. But we also serve families. And one of the reasons we're so busy right now is because we're seeing a lot of families again that we didn't see during the pandemic. Because what happened was during the pandemic, there was all kinds of assistance that people don't normally get. There were child tax credits. There were stimulus. There were special food distributions that required very little of the people that were receiving it except to drive through. The school district did them, the Salvation Army did them. So we found that we were serving mostly homeless folks. Percentage of our total people that we served that were homeless was higher because those were the folks that didn't have access to the special pandemic relief. The people that didn't need us as much as they used to, especially the child tax credit. Because families with kids were getting extra money each month and didn't need to go to a food pantry after they paid the rent for the utilities. That's changed. So what we're seeing now is all those families coming back. We're still serving a lot of homeless people, but on top of that, we're serving families with children, have a place to live, and periodically throughout the year, pay the rent, pay the utilities, and whatever other bills they can't get away with avoiding, and end up thinking about the food last. That's where food pantries come in. We have a second food pantry that's on the west side of Salt Lake City in the Poplar Grove neighborhood. And this food pantry is in a building that we rent at 1358 West Indiana, which is about 850 south. So if you take 8 southwest and cross the Jordan River, that's Indiana. So the West Side Food Pantry has been around since 2017, and it is now very busy. We've been keeping an eye on it ever since we started to see if it was worth having a second location. It was going to be busy. And one of the reasons we started it is because other people were getting out of the food pantry business. So there are some providers that provide emergency food for decades and no longer do that at all. Today, I'm really glad we opened the West Side Food Pantry because it's going like gangbusters. Because those families are coming in and really need that assistance. The other key difference between our downtown location and the west side location is who we're helping. We serve more families on the west side, but we do serve homeless folks as well. But we also serve majority of the people that we serve on the west side are Latinx, Latinos, and on downtown, still the majority of the people we serve are white. So there's quite a difference in the neighborhood. Poplar Grove neighborhood is one of the lower income neighborhoods in the city. And I think 70% of the people that live there are people of color. So we also have a thrift store in that same neighborhood, almost right across the street. So that thrift store that we started back in 1966 bounced around the town. It was in a building real close to Liberty Park for many, many years. And in the 90s, we purchased a building at 14th West in Indiana, 1385 West Indiana, and moved the thrift store there. We've been there ever since. So there we give away stuff for anything people give us, we give away for them. And we also help people with new kids' shoes. We just got a big shipment of blankets from Church World Service, coats from Operation Warm. And most of that stuff is all given away free. 88% of everything that comes into the store goes out on a voucher for free to somebody that needs it. So those are kind of our essential direct services. And here's some more pictures of the food pantry downtown. We have a kitchen, we have a walk-in freezer downtown, we have a reach-in cooler, so we can handle a lot more frozen stuff than a lot of emergency food pantries. And in the kitchen, the old kitchen, which has been extensively remodeled, as you can imagine, we can repackage any kind of food legally, really, except for certain kinds of meat. And we make a ton of sandwiches for those day bags that go to homeless folks. We used to call them street orders, but our new pantry director, I call him our new pantry director, he's been there 2 years. He calls them GDs for general delivery. So if you're ever at Crossroads and somebody says, I need a GD, that's what they're talking about. This is a little bit more of the kitchen. That's our waiting room, which has now changed. We've made the waiting room more institutional than it's been, because during the pandemic, we quit having in-person meetings just like everybody else. And we found that when the construction started on either side of us, there was no place to park. So we don't really have board meetings in our building. When the board meets together live, we usually find a local church or some other facility that will host us. So we've been turning our waiting room, which used to double as the board, into more a place that's more useful to the people that we're serving. So now we have, since this picture was taken, we have a drinking fountain with a bottle filler, because access to water has become more important than ever. And we also have put in a different kind of flooring. We've raised some money. The next thing we're going to do is put a reach-in cooler in that room so people have access to cold stuff and produce in the cooler and they can serve themselves. So we're just trying to be more useful to the people we're serving now, which is quite a bit different than 30 years ago. So that's somebody, a volunteer bagging groceries in the pantry. We serve people from all over the county, sometimes outside the county. We don't have any zip code restrictions like some food pantries do. And you don't have to prove your citizenship. We do ask for ID, but it can be any. We just want to know how many people are in the family. So if you're hungry, we're going to feed you. That's our philosophy. We're not going to quibble about immigration status or anything else like that. And we also help with hygiene kits. When we have stuff, we get calls for feminine hygiene products, razors, soap, shampoo. Lately, we've been as there are more seniors experiencing poverty and homelessness in particular. We are starting to try to stock adult diapers, which we've never done before. But we do specialize in infant needs at both of our pantries. We always have baby formula. Even when there was a shortage, we were able to keep a stock of baby formula. We always have diapers, although larger sizes are hard to get in because people want to donate small sizes. Very few people want to donate size 6. So keep that in mind if you're doing a diaper bag. Large sizes, the ones that we don't get that people are always asking for. So we help with infant needs. We help with food, hygiene products, like this says cat food, dog food when we have it. Because sometimes people will come in just for that. Often that relationship is key to the people that are coming to us for help. It's one of the most important relationships they have. So we try to help with that as well. And then we have an emergency fund. And the emergency fund helps with utility shutoffs. We'll probably stop something like 250 utility shutoffs this year by helping people with a payment when they get a 48-hour cutoff notice, which is the kind they tack on your door. And then getting the utility company to enter into a payment arrangement with the people. So that's been really big this year. We also help with prescriptions, with gasoline vouchers, which is really taken off now that the price of gas has been so high for so long. And we help with things like transit passes. We give away 200 day passes every week. And our pantry director, if he was here, would tell you that part of the reason why he thinks that's super important is because on a day, weather like this, when it's so cold, even if people can't get inside anywhere, If they have a day pass, they can ride tracks. And it keeps them warm. But people have reasons where they need to get to services. They need to get to the shelters, which are no longer co-located in one neighborhood, but are scattered all over. They need to get to work. A lot of people work. Or a medical. So we do a lot of day passes every week as well. So those are some of the services you can get at Crossroads. And that's the emergency fund. Okay. Get on all those. It says rent. We no longer do rent. We just focus on utility shutoffs. The emergency fund is something like, when we talk about it with the board of directors, it will take as much money as you can put into it. It's a bottomless pit. The need is big enough that whatever we decide to spend on the emergency fund is going to be. This year, though, we made a commitment to massively increase the emergency fund. And we increased it by 63% from what it was last year. So this year we're spending something between $85,000 and $90,000 on stuff like this that I just mentioned, and none of that goes to administration. It's just money that's used for transit passes for those things that go directly to people. So that's the emergency fund. And this is what a pharmacy voucher looks like, and a gasoline voucher. We only work with one pharmacy. It's at the old Holy Cross Hospital, Salt Lake Regional Medical Center. So we send people there when they have a prescription that we can help with. Prescriptions have become a lot less of a problem since Medicaid expansion. There's an example of another issue that you learn about when you do direct services, but that if there's a public policy change, it can make all the difference. So, I mean, it's hard to imagine, but we used to have a whole lot of people who didn't fit into the healthcare system. We helped all the time. We used to spend over $10,000 a year just on prescriptions. This year it'll be more like $3,000. The reason is so many more people are eligible for Medicaid for assistance with essential prescriptions. And usually we're just helping people like a senior who's in the donut hole, or somebody who is applying for Medicaid that needs to get a prescription right now and hasn't got clearance. So we do a lot of that too. Those are a couple of examples. The gas station is the one at 7th East and 2nd South with big Sinclair dinosaur. We just work with one gas station. And I think I mentioned our services for infants. And then we're gearing up next week for our big holiday food giveaway. So we do 2 of those every holiday season. One is for Thanksgiving, and that's Wednesday. It's going to be at the Smith's Ballpark parking lot, which is right across the street from the baseball park at 13th South and West Temple. And we started this with the pandemic, where we started a drive-through distribution in a parking lot in 2020. You know, we like the way that's gone, so we did that again last year, and we're doing it again this year. People just come and drive through, and volunteers will put a turkey and some sides into their car, and they move on. And we will help. Last year was about 2,500 households. The first year during 2020, during the height of the pandemic, we served over 3,000 households, but it seems to have leveled off. Now, with the increase in need that we're seeing at our pantries, we really don't know. We're kind of prepared for 3,500, but we'll see how that goes. And then at Christmas, we work with Roland Hall School in Salt Lake City at 8th South and about 11th East, 10th East. And they do a food distribution where we give people a lot more food, and we serve a lot fewer families. It'll be more like 650 households. And they get turkey and all the sides. We buy sweet potatoes, we buy fresh produce. Those are really good food packages. And most of the volunteers come from the Roland Hall School. So we've done those giveaways for a very long time. And this is a picture of the old thrift store by Liberty Park. And that woman right there on that side of the picture, that's Virginia Parmalee. Virginia is kind of like Lowell Benton. She was a legend. She ran our thrift store and worked in our food pantry and was a board member and never got paid for anything. She ran a thrift store for 22 years as a volunteer. You could not beg her to take a vacation. If she got an award, and she got many awards, first you had to trick her into going to receive the award. And then when she got there and they asked her to say something, she'd stand up and just say, instead of, thank you, or whatever, she'd say, we need large women's clothes and pots and pans. And she'd go through the list of stuff that she was out of the thrift store and she'd sit down. So today our thrift store is in a building that's named after Virginia Farmer, and one that we bought in the 90s. This is the old thrift store. There's the new one. That's the back view. And that's the view from Indiana Avenue. And this is what it looks like inside. A little different than the old store. So we sell things at low cost. Anybody can shop at the thrift store. But we also, of course, give most of the things that come in away from food. And this is a thrift store voucher. So people can get 3 outfits, pair of shoes, a coat for every member of their family. We let people come as often as once a month because we often don't have what they need. We're giving away primarily what people give us. So if we, having a size 10.5 work boot, that's not going to happen a lot. So people often will come back and check with us to see if we have the things that they need. We also have a partnership that I mentioned briefly, but it's with KSL's Quarters for Christmas program. So every year KSL does a drop to raise money. And mostly it's to help kids with new shoes. So we do, I think last month we helped 170 kids get new shoes. And sometimes these are the only new shoes kids in some of the families have, because typically they're just wearing whatever gets passed down as long as the soles hold. So that's been a really nice partnership that we've had with KSL for a long time. That's allowed us to really add value to the youth stuff. And I think I mentioned some of the other partnerships. We were anxiously waiting for our shipment of blankets for Church World Service, but we have to compete with the hurricane season. So they were a little long in coming, but right now we're stocked up with blankets for the winter too. And we also give those away downtown. So one of the things that's happened at our downtown food pantry as things have evolved is that because we serve so many people who are unsheltered on the street, we now give away blankets, hats, gloves, ponchos, emergency blankets, all kinds of things like that to people from the downtown pantry so that they don't have to go to the thrift store to receive those things. So that's a little bit about the thrift store. And this is our west side pantry. Not the most attractive building, but inside it's real nice. That's the waiting area. And we actually have an overhead door there. So what happens is when you go to the west side food pantry, you come in and you do the intake with you and find out what you need. And then we just have to go out and wait in your car and we wheel the food out to you through the overhead door. So that's been working real well. That's another picture. So before we move on to the next piece here, I just wanted to give you some idea of how many people we serve. This year, we're going to serve over 60,000 people. And that's a duplicated count. Some of those people come once, some might come half a dozen times. We're going to stop 250 utility shutoffs. We're going to help 2,700 kids with infant supplies, diapers, formula, and shoes. The usage of our food pantries right now is up 70% over where it was last year at this time. And at the thrift store, just looking at the free stuff we give away, we're up 60%. And as I mentioned, we've increased our emergency fund by 63%. So there's a high level of need out there that we're really, if I'm going to a benefit concert tomorrow, everybody's supposed to bring some food. I'll bring it back to Crossroads Monday. I bet by the end of the day, Tuesday, none of that food will be left. That's how fast things are going on. And we also need volunteers. So if anybody ever wants to volunteer, particularly on the west side, it's much easier for us to recruit volunteers on the east side, which is I think proximity, I suppose, but the thrift store in Westlake Pantry also really. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit and then maybe have some discussion about this whole notion of this slide. It says the why. We help people with emergency needs, but we want to know why else they're coming. What is the reason why they need to come to us? And that has led to what I mentioned, the commitment to community organizing. So one of the projects that we have that does that is called the Coalition of Religious Communities, which was started in 1995. So I mentioned that Crossroads comes from a faith-based tradition. And then we kind of broadened that tradition to include a lot more Christian communities. And then over the years, we broadened it again to include people of all different kinds of faiths. So we've had Jewish folks on the board, Muslim people. I had a Baha'i board member at one time, we had Jewish board chiefs. We really intentionally wanted to become multi, because all different faith traditions have that in common, the concern for the poor and oppressed. What we wanted to do was to form, in terms of the Coalition of Religious Communities, a group that would work on the things that we have in common. Economic justice is what we call it. So low-income housing, Medicaid expansion, ending the tax on groceries, funding for essential human services programs, including food pantries throughout the state. Those are the kinds of issues that the Coalition for Religious Communities works on. We started that in 1995 because for many years, because of our role in the community as a faith-based organization, when an issue would come up that we thought needed to be addressed, some crisis that was facing the low-income community, I or somebody else would get on the phone and call every single pastor we could find and get them to sign a letter. And then we'd call it the Concerned Religious Leaders of Utah, and they'd have a press conference. And then when that issue was over, we'd have to start all over again. So we formed court to have an ongoing vehicle to do that work. And today it's really our faith-based lobbying. So people from all different faith traditions come. The next big thing that Cork is going to do is a rally at the Capitol on January 19th to kick off the legislative session, talking about the issues that are important, like very low income housing, and permanently supportive housing that helps people with services and gets them off the street into permanent housing that they can stay in and helps them, transition. What we found is you hear a lot of controversy about something called housing first. Housing first really is the idea that people shouldn't have to, we shouldn't have to fix people up so that they qualify for housing. If we get people into housing and then help them with the issues that they may have, whether it's substance abuse or mental health or whatever else it may be, that's a more successful way of helping people. We know this because at Crossroads, we used to see guys that I was sure were going to die on the street. You'd see them every day or virtually every day, always in a bad state. And they disappeared. I thought, we all thought, well, so-and-so has finally died. But then we started meeting people who'd gotten into permanently supported housing. That's why they disappeared. And they look like people. It's the one thing I've seen that really works. So we spend a lot of time advocating for that. We have another group that we're running right now. It's called Powerful Moms Who Care. And Powerful Moms Who Care is a group made up of women with children who've experienced homelessness. And very many of them are in permanently supported housing or sometimes in the family shelter down in Midvale. And there's a crisis right now that we're really focused on in family homelessness. So for many, many years, for as long as I can remember, every winter, the winter would be coming, and there would be, the shelters would be full. And where are we going to put people so they can get off the street when it's 20 degrees? And that was always a problem. Last year, for instance, they didn't get it together to open a winter overflow shelter until January. And it was primarily for single men. This year, the legislature passed a law saying local governments had to have a plan in place by September 1st. And they actually did have a plan in place for single men. They're, allowed to expand capacity of the existing shelters. There's a temporary shelter down in Mill Creek at the old Smith Branch Library on 33rd South. That's going to be open for 100 people. And so there is a plan to get single people off the street during the winter. But what nobody anticipated is that now that crisis is facing families. So the family shelter in Midvale has been over capacity all year. It's made for 300 people. It's had at least 400 people. There's no community space left because it's all being used to house people. They tell people that your kids have to be within 5 feet of you at all times, if you can imagine. You better parent, even know the challenge that may be. And they have to turn people away that come in who need shelter or let them camp in the parking lot. In September alone, they turned away 70. So our advocacy efforts like Powerful Moms Who Care in Cork have all been geared lately on saying, we need to do something about this. We need to expand vouchers for hotels because that's traditionally the way they take care of overflow in the shelter is by expanding vouchers that they can give people to go stay in motels, and then they have caseworkers that check in with those folks. Those are all used up. The shelter's full, people are getting turned away. So if you can imagine having a very small child living in your car in this weather, that's what people are doing. And it's not necessary. It doesn't need to happen. We were trying to get the governor to have a special session to allocate more money to expand the voucher program, but he didn't do it. And right now, there is no solution to that problem. They're actually talking about trying to come up with ways for churches to give people permission to park in the parking lots, which doesn't make anybody any wrong. It just keeps the police from moving them along, which is some small. So that's a huge issue that we're also going to take into the legislative session in January and focus on the need for possibly creating a second family shelter. At the very least, a family shelter that can be used for overflow in the winter. And possibly also funding permanently supported housing development for families. Because one of the issues the Powerful Moms has worked on ever since they were founded is there are families that are in permanently supported housing mixed in with permanently supported housing for individuals and couples, and it doesn't mesh very well because there are all kinds of issues with security, drug use, different things that the families are having problems integrating into that community, like Palmer Court is the principal.
What's your position on the 10 cities they're talking about? Is that something?
That's a very interesting question. Yeah, I do. I haven't thought about that. I think I know why people advocate for that. And I know people on the far left and on the far right think establishing a permanent camp where people can go is a great idea because there are so many people camping on the street anyway.
Right.
And they get moved around.
They have
it's a big hassle.
They have no hygiene.
Yeah, right. That's right. The thing that I think about that though is it's kind of a slippery slope. If we tell people, you can't camp here because we have a designated campground here, aren't we kind of taking off the pressure to actually find solutions and house people? Because we have a campground. So it's okay for you to go to the camp. Now, what are you going to do in the winter? So you have a dedicated camp. It's not in Texas, it's in Salt Lake City. And it gets to be 20 degrees at night. What happens to the folks in the camp? Are we going to just continue to let them live in that camp? Now you're responsible because you have established the camp, welcome people in. You're responsible for what happens in it. So logistically it's difficult. I think psychologically it takes the pressure off trying to bring people inside. It makes this camp, the idea of camping outside, an acceptable alternative that we as a society support. So I think it's problematic for those reasons. I also wonder who's going to live there because the proposals I've heard for camps say, no drugs, no alcohol. It's going to be, pretty controlled environment. And there are all kinds of people on the street, some of whom would welcome coming to a camp like that, and some who probably would never stay there or would get kicked out on this. Where are those folks? Right back to where they are. So it's something that may need to happen. But if it does, it's kind of a shame that that's where we are. Creating space for people to sleep outside instead of trying to figure out ways to bring them in. So I think it's a more complicated issue for me than a lot of people see.
Does your experience say to you that certain people won't go indoors? Or for any reason, in other words, they want to be free from society?
Not very many. There are a few, but it's a really small number.
Okay.
There are people who won't go to shelter. That's probably the larger. But if people actually get a legitimate chance to have a place to live, most people do that and are happy with it. There are a few, but I think they're really outliers in my experience. Now, what people say on the street too is not necessarily reality. Because if you're, in a camp and you just don't want to be bothered, you tried everything. You're going to say whatever, oh, I don't want to go to the shelter because, or fill in the blank. So that happens too.
So need is the problem with most everybody, that they don't have the ability to get off the street, is really what you're saying.
Yeah, in terms of folks who are homeless, there's a lot of different reasons why people are on the street. Sometimes it's bad luck. You've been evicted, you've fallen all the way in. It takes so much money to get back into the house. It's so hard with an eviction on your record now. I mean, right now, people are sometimes charging $200-300 just to apply for it. And if you have to come up with first and last month's rent on the deposit, that's a really steep bill for people to fund. So sometimes it's just economic. Sometimes it's substance abuse. Sometimes it's mental illness. And sometimes it's really hard to tell which was first. If you're homeless on the street and you're experiencing mental illness, drugs might seem like a real good idea. And one thing leads to another. Or if you're experiencing a substance abuse issue, maybe you end up on the street with mental illness, because being on the street will make you crazy. So there's a lot of dual diagnosis stuff going on with people too. So I think there's a lot of reasons why people are on the street, probably just as many reasons as there are people. But those are the three principal things that happen. People have bad luck and end up homeless because of economic factors, lose a job, whatever. Physical disabilities, another factor, can't work, and lose everything. And it's also substance abuse and mental illness. And all of those things need to be addressed more effectively in order to solve the problem. But right now, it's an issue of resources. So there's just not enough shelter beds. You might remember a few years ago, the road home, the principal shelter provider, had a big shelter right across the street on Rio Grande Street from where the Catholics have their soup kitchen, St. Vincent de Paul, and behind that's the day center. And there was a lot of pressure to get rid of that shelter. But the new plan was to have a scattered site model of 3 shelters with 400 fewer places to sleep. Would say beds, but they weren't necessarily beds. They could just be space on the floor, mats. And we said capacity is really important. You have to have room for everybody. But they went ahead with that plan, and immediately those shelters were full. They had hard caps. They couldn't expand capacity. And this is where we are now, with more people on the street than anybody. If you live in Salt Lake City, it's certainly true for me. Anybody can remember seeing it. Now, it's important to know that this is a nationwide problem too. It's not just Salt Lake City. Yeah, we're seeing more people camping on the street than ever before, absolutely. But that's true in every major city you can name right now. It has to do with gentrification, rising rents, sort of economics of our cities right now. And how many people are getting left. It's more than ever before. So. So what I wanted to talk about, I think I've given you a lot of information about Crossroads, and I'm happy to answer any other questions. But what I really wanted to try and talk about was how can we combine. Crossroads offers emergency services. So we're trying to help you get through the day, the week, the month. That's all we're doing. We're not doing casework. We're not trying to change your life necessarily. We hope, we'll be useful in that regard, but we're not social workers. I have one social worker on staff, and that's kind of an accident. So there are other groups that do that work, and we need them. We need those services expanded, mental health, substance abuse counseling, all kinds of things, trying to get people into housing. But what we do, our focus has been, what can we do that helps people right now with an emergency? And then the other part of that is, how do we work on the issues that we see every day come through the front door so that people need us less? So what I kind of wanted to talk about in the next, we have 13 minutes or so, is can you think of examples where something you've been involved in, where you learned something about people that you were helping with direct service, whatever that is, that caused you to think about a policy issue or a way that we're doing things as a community that we could do better? And how do we link those two things together? That's kind of what I think about a lot. Like us working on affordable housing, us knowing that there's a crisis in family homelessness now, trying to call attention to it, more people. Can you think of any other examples where you've been involved in something, or you're trying to help people right now, and you say, boy, something should really change, so I might have to do this? Does that ring a bell to anybody? Yeah. Go ahead.
So I work with the Red Cross. I'm the volunteer lead for the Salt Lake area, and so I'm pretty aware of a lot of volunteer opportunities. I'm just aware that are available in the region. And a big issue that we had starting when the pandemic started was pretty much all of our emergency services. When it came to disaster, all those volunteers left when the pandemic started, so they had to completely start over their entire program. And even though we are technically still in a pandemic, they're still facing a lot of issues with volunteers being willing to come in various regions in Utah specifically to just come out and help out with disasters. And I work directly with the University of Utah. We're trying to get a lot of college students to fill in those certain roles, but say in rural areas, for example, we had the fire out in Sugar House, but if there was a fire in a different area, when we try to call out volunteers to go help out, some people just aren't willing to make the drive out to go help out with that specific case work. There's just a lot of bureaucracy, especially within the Red Cross, and just certain people have to connect to each other that just aren't there because everyone left. And that's something that we've been trying to work with, and it's genuinely so hard for me as a recruiter to try to help out with that, just because I'm in an urban area. I'm not in those specific outreach rural regions, if that makes sense. So we have a huge gap within our own organization as well to help out. So I definitely understand where you're coming from.
We had a similar thing happen in Crossroads where before the pandemic, a lot of our very best volunteers were seniors, folks who were retired. And, this was their retirement job. And they would do, a shift or a day every week. And all those people are gone and didn't come back. So we've had to kind of reinvent our volunteer program so that there are more opportunities for people to drop in and help out whenever they have time. We also do an online orientation now for volunteers. And we have a sign-up tool on the website so people can pick shifts. A lot of things that we didn't used to do, just trying to increase the number of opportunities for people to come and volunteer. It used to be we would ask people to make more of a commitment. And even still, we're not getting any volunteers on the website. Yes, sir.
How old do your volunteers have to be?
I usually say 14 unless they're coming with a parent.
Have you talked to the Key Club at West?
No, I don't think so.
They've got a big Key Club. Sorry about this. Should projects around.
No, that's a good
They've
idea.
got a big key club and they have service projects.
Yeah. We often get kids from Judge Memorial because they have a service.
I'll
learning
put my name down, Wesley Sign, and I'll find out who you should talk to at West, as
Okay,
far as the kids are concerned.
key club.
And if I call this downtown number, will that get to you?
It will. Yes, it will.
I'll give you a call.
Yeah. Okay, great. That'd be great. Yeah, because we have used high school kids, particularly West High School, because they have West High School Judge. Because they have they have a community service component in their curriculum where people have to do so many hours.
Yeah.
We
That's
also,
about 60 kids strong, and so
that would be great.
that would be
Yeah.
a good possibility.
That might really
work and where to go.
It might really also help us get more help on the west side, which would be great.
Yeah.
Because that's something we're really struggling with. Anybody else?
Why don't you give me your telephone number? I've got your.
Yeah, sure. Anybody else have any examples that you can think of? Or here's another question. Why do you think it might be hard to
Thank
do
you.
both direct services and advocacy from the same organization?
I was actually gonna ask you that question. Because I mean, I see a lot of things that are hard about it. I'm also in kind of a volunteer coordinator position at the moment. And especially with like issues relating to like hunger and homelessness, like I think especially in that issue area, just because it is such immediate needs, like definitely has like a history of kind of like saviorism or just like participating with the volunteer, like feels like they did something good for Christmas or something, right? Which like you're still meeting immediate needs, and so it's not like necessarily bad, but like I have been wondering like how to approach that better, just like with the people. Feel today, like we kind of wish we wish that we weren't here doing this, right? Because we wish people weren't hungry, but so like I was actually gonna ask you that, how you kind of help lead or guide people through the transition from like volunteering to feel good about themselves, to they're like actually understand their needs.
Yeah, it's challenging and different people will react differently. One, I like to think of it as trying to help people move from charity to justice.
Yeah.
So charity is pretty entry level kind of thing. Most people, not everybody, most people have some concern about people that when they see people in need. If somebody's doing a food drive in their neighborhood or their church or whatever, they're going to participate in that. You know, donating that can of food is something most people can do, and very many people will do. But how do you create the link between, okay, I'm donating food to the food pantry, but really people need more affordable places to live, so they don't need the food. How do you make that connection? And that's kind of where Cork came from a faith-based perspective, but lately too, this is going to take me on various tangents, but lately too, we've been thinking a lot about organized religion. At least a lot of the churches that have supported us traditionally are struggling, and the pandemic didn't help. I think that there were churches that were on the decline, and then when the pandemic happened and nobody could go to the church, that kind of accelerated the process. And so if we're not going to find the good people that we need to help, volunteer, donate, support our work in churches, where are we going to find them? And we have found, because the story is, I talked about how we became multi-faith. Really, we're more of a true community sign now. We have support from people who have no faith commitment at all, instead of being our leaders in our organization. So we've kind of evolved where we still honor those faith-based roots, but we've become bigger, something that appeals to more people. But we're really thinking like Cork, Polish and religious communities. How do we create an organization that involves people who may not consider themselves religious, but still care about other people and what happens and how people are treated? How do we bring those folks in too. So that's something that we struggle with, and I don't think, we don't have the answer to that. That's one issue that we have. The other things that I was thinking of is, two of the reasons Crossroads can get away with providing direct services and advocating at the legislative level, at the city council, talking to the mayor, which could be a meeting or it could be a protest or a press conference. One of the reasons we can do both of those things is because we don't have any government funding. So our whole budget's about $1 million. $20,000 is government. So if we need to challenge public officials on the issue, we can do that because we have more independence than, say, an organization where 90% of their budget is from a federal grant. And they really have to stay in their lane. That makes it very difficult for them to advocate in any kind of aggressive way for the people that they serve, because they can't endanger their funding, or they won't be able to provide the services that they're able to provide. We don't have that problem. It also means we have to hustle a lot. I have to get a lot of little grants. The number one revenue source for us are just people that write checks. So right now we're doing our holiday solicitation, which I've done for a long time. I mean, I'm not big on begging people for money. It's a hard skill to learn, but people are very good to us in that way, especially during the holidays. And we make that money last all year because it's not coming from a government entity. We're able to speak out on issues that we care about. So that's one thing that I think has been really important for why Crossroads can do that. And also because we're pretty grassroots. Crossroads is real. If you come to Crossroads, you'll see you come in the door, there's, folks milling about, there's people using the phone, there's somebody trying to calm down somebody who's having an episode, there's, any number of things. It's not, it's a real down to earth kind of place. And I think we do that intentionally. People are comfortable there, volunteers are comfortable there for the most part. But the idea is that we stay pretty close to the people that we serve. In fact, even on our board, we have a rule that 50% or more have to be people that are defined in our mission statement. So we have the support community and we have something we call community served, which are kind of outdated terms. But what that means is in our mission statement, we talk about trying to help folks with disabilities, people of color, and low-income folks. And so half of the board or more fit those categories so that we can stay true to our mission and really not stray too far as do-gooders from what people really need, because people know what they need for the most part of this.
With the unemployment so low, why do people not have jobs?
I think, well, people do have jobs.
Well, I mean, those that are on the street,
Yeah,
because they don't have jobs.
I think it's because of the three things I talked about. They've dug up, the hole has been dug and they're struggling to get out. It's very difficult to hold a job when you're living in a shelter and camping and trying to, get somewhere, be presentable, show up on time, any number of things. So it can be difficult, not impossible. People do it. People do it amazingly enough. Or substance abuse or mental illness. There's a lot of mental health issues that are untreated on the street. So those might be reasons why people on the street aren't able to kind of dig themselves out with employment. But I think that really the reason that we're so busy right now, even when unemployment is low, is because things cost so much. Price of food's gone up like 13% in the last year. Price of gas, the price of rent is astronomically higher than forever. And all of those pandemic benefits have fallen away at the same time. So even when people are working, some of our clients do, it's hard to make ends meet and pay the rent. That's what's happening. Now, people on the street have a lot of other barriers. Once you're homeless, it's very, very difficult to get back out. Some people manage to do it in a couple of months, some people it takes years. And I think the longer you're experiencing that trauma, homelessness, the harder it can be.
Is there a program to help people move from being on the street to being able to work? Some place where they can clean themselves up or anything like that. Who's handling that in the?
Well, there's different programs. I mean, there's a group called the Other Side Academy that mostly works with people who had substance abuse issues and that in the criminal justice.
Yeah, but on the other side, it's small compared to the problem.
Absolutely, and so are we. There's not like, a big public program that does that. Mostly we deal with homelessness through nonprofits. We don't have, there's no public shelter. Now, there might be public funding, but the public funding relies on.
The only reason I ask you, you're kind of on the street and you can see it because you're dealing with people that are having the problem.
Yeah. Well, if you came to Crossroads and hung out one day, just see who comes in and out, I think you'd have a lot better sense for some of the challenges that people are facing, that we're serving. And what kinds of states of disrepair people are in. It would make it super hard for them to get employment unless they were able to deal with some of those issues, which is partly why I advocate so much for housing first. Because if we can get people off the street and into housing and surrounded by supportive services, they can get to a place where they can be independent and work and stabilize for sure. But it's very difficult to do that from the.
So you're
Camp
almost
on
looking
first
at a
site.
campus where you'd have housing and then you'd have the services around that to take care of the housing.
Yeah, someplace, I'm not as much in favor of campus ideas. I am of permanently supported housing developments that may be scattered around. And even like
mingled in with society.
Yeah, as opposed to having a separate place that has a fence around it, that is where we keep the homeless. I think it's better to have.
Stigmatize them.
Yeah, I think it's better to try and integrate folks into the larger community as much as we can.
You're supposed to have low cost housing. Every one of these buildings that's being built, they're supposed to have the low cost housing. Is that functioning or is it not functioning, or do you know?
No, every place, no. Actually, I think what you're talking about is something that's sometimes called inclusionary zoning, where government passes a rule that if you're developing new housing, a certain percentage of it has to be affordable. That is not it's not something that's prominent in Utah. In fact, the legislature has restricted it severely. At the behest of the builders who don't want to do that sort of thing. There's only one community in the whole state that has inclusionary zoning, and that's Park City.
Really?
That's it.
That's a surprise.
I'm over time, I realize. So
Sorry about that.
Let me tell you one thing before I go. I'm old enough that I actually knew Dr. Ben when he was at the Community Services Council. And my favorite story about Dr. Ben is he used to teach at the LDS Institute of Religion here on the campus. And then he went to the Community Services Council, which houses the Utah Olympic, and he worked there. And somebody said, how's it been going from the U to working at the Community Services Council? And he said, I used to teach religion. Now I practice. That's all I have. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So thank you so much for participating in this session, and a special thank you to Glenn for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. There will be a short survey sent out shortly after the conference. We would greatly appreciate your feedback so that we can continue improving the conference.